Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. The sun dipped below the western horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of amber and violet as Jesse Harlan secured his campsite for the night. At 32, Jesse had spent most of his adult life in motion, drifting across the frontier with little more than his horse, Penny, a weathered saddle, and whatever supplies fit in his saddlebags. His face, tanned and lined despite his relatively young age, spoke of countless days spent beneath open skies, while his hands, calloused and strong, showed the varied work he'd taken on during his travels. The small clearing he'd chosen sat a comfortable distance from the trail, nestled near the bend of an old creek bed that held only the memory of water this late in the summer. A massive cottonwood tree dominated the clearing, its sprawling branches reaching skyward like ancient fingers stretching toward the emerging stars. There was something majestic about a lone tree standing defiant against the vast openness of the prairie, a solitary sentinel that had somehow survived drought, lightning, and the brutal winter winds that scoured these lands. "What do you think, girl?" Jesse murmured to Penny as he brushed her down for the night. The mare nickered softly in response, seeming content with the patch of grass he'd found for her. "Yeah, not a bad spot to rest our bones." He'd been riding for 2 weeks now, making his way south from Blackwater, where a brief stint working the docks had earned him enough money to continue his journey. His destination was Armadillo, or perhaps beyond to the border, though Jesse rarely held firmly to any planned route. The frontier had taught him the value of flexibility, of following opportunity or instinct, rather than rigid intentions. With Penny settled, Jesse set about preparing his own simple dinner. Coffee bubbling in a battered pot at the edge of his small fire, beans warming beside it, and a few strips of jerky to round out the meal. As darkness fully claimed the land, he noticed the first fireflies beginning to emerge along the creek bed, their gentle lights blinking like earthbound stars among the dry grasses and dormant cattails. The peaceful setting invited contemplation, and Jesse found his thoughts drifting to the letter, folded carefully in his breast pocket. The reason for his southward journey after nearly 3 years of wandering the northern territories. Sarah's handwriting, neat and precise as always, had found him in Blackwater, after passing through half a dozen post offices that had held her letters until he chanced to check for mail. His younger sister had written of their father's failing health, the struggling family ranch outside Armadillo, and her unspoken hope that Jesse might finally return home. "Been away too long," he admitted quietly to himself, pouring coffee into a tin cup and settling back against his saddle. The rich aroma mingled with the scent of dry grass and wood smoke, creating that distinctive perfume of prairie nights that had become more familiar to him than any town or settlement. As Jesse sipped his coffee and watched the fire's glow push back the darkness, he became aware of a subtle movement in his peripheral vision. Turning slightly, he noticed what appeared to be a lantern light among the highest branches of the cottonwood tree. A warm golden glow swaying gently as if stirred by a breeze, though the night air remained perfectly still around him. He straightened, setting his cup aside as he focused on the unexpected light. It wasn't the cool blue-white flicker of fireflies, nor the shifting red reg of his campfire reflected on leaves. This was unmistakably a lantern's glow, steady and purposeful, hanging among branches that must have been 30 feet above the ground. "Hello," Jesse called, rising to his feet. "Someone up there?" No answer came, only the soft chirping of crickets and the occasional distant cry of a nighthawk. The light continued its gentle swaying, casting a small pool of illumination among the cottonwood's highest reaches. Jesse circled the massive trunk, studying the tree from different angles. No ladder or rope was visible, no clear means for anyone to have climbed so high, especially carrying a lit lantern. "Peculiar," he murmured, returning to his fire. The light didn't seem threatening. Quite the opposite. There was something almost comforting about its steady presence above him, like a sentinel keeping watch through the night. After considering whether to investigate further, Jesse decided to simply observe. The cottonwood's trunk was too thick to climb easily, especially in darkness, and disturbing whatever mystery presented itself seemed unnecessary when it offered no apparent danger. He settled back against his saddle, occasionally glancing up at the swaying light as he finished his simple dinner and prepared for sleep. When he finally wrapped himself in his blanket, the lantern still glowed steadily among the branches, casting its gentle radiance down upon his campsite like a watchful guardian. "Good night," then Jesse murmured toward the light, feeling only slightly foolish for addressing it. "Whoever or whatever you are," the fire died down to glowing embers. Jesse's eyes grew heavy, and sleep claimed him beneath the cottonwood spreading canopy. His last conscious thought was wondering whether the light would remain until morning, or if it would disappear like so many mysterious things did when examined too closely in daylight's revealing glare. Morning arrived with the distinctive chorus of prairie awakening, the melodic trilling of meadowlarks, the rustle of small creatures moving through dry grass, and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the gentle rise to the east. Jesse woke with the first grey light, a habit formed through years of outdoor living, and immediately glanced toward the cottonwood's upper branches. As he had halfway expected, no lantern was visible among the gently stirring leaves, no sign that anything unusual had occupied that space during the night. Rising and stretching muscles stiff from ground sleeping, Jesse methodically began his morning routine. Stirring the fire's remnants back to life, setting coffee to boil, checking on Penny, who grazed contentedly nearby. As he moved around his campsite, he studied the cottonwood more carefully in growing daylight. The tree was indeed massive, its grey-brown bark deeply furrowed with age, lower branches thick enough for a man to walk upon if he could reach them. The highest branches, where he'd seen the light, seemed impossibly distant from the ground. "Didn't dream it," he assured himself quietly, remembering the steady, golden glow. His mind wasn't given to fanciful imaginings. Years of practical frontier living had ground such tendencies out of him. Yet neither could he immediately explain what he'd witnessed. The mystery might have been temporarily set aside, as Jesse prepared to continue his journey, had he not noticed something while gathering his scattered gear. Near the base of the cottonwood, partially concealed by a gnarled root that broke the soil surface, sat a weathered wooden stump that had been shaped into a crude bench. Its surface was smooth from years of use, the wood silver-grey with age and exposure. Someone had spent considerable time sitting here, facing westward toward the horizon where the trail continued. Jesse ran his hand across the smooth surface, feeling the subtle indentations worn by a person sitting in the same spot, day after day, perhaps year after year. Looking more carefully at the ground surrounding the stump bench, he noticed that although tall prairie grass grew everywhere else in the clearing, The earth directly around this sitting place remained relatively bare, as if regularly disturbed. "Someone comes here," he concluded, glancing between the bench and the highest branches where he'd seen the light. The connection seemed obvious, though its meaning remained elusive. His planned early departure slipped away as curiosity took hold. Jesse decided to delay his journey by a few hours to investigate further. Securing Penny on a long lead that allowed her to graze comfortably, he began a more thorough exploration of the area surrounding the cottonwood. The dry creek bed yielded little information. It had clearly once carried water regularly, but now served as a drainage route only during the heaviest rains. Yet as Jesse followed its curving path westward, he discovered a surprising sight. Approximately 50 yards from his campsite, a small patch of deliberately planted wildflowers bloomed defiantly against the summer dryness. Someone had created a tiny garden here, the carefully arranged stones surrounding it channeling occasional moisture from the creek bed when rain did come. More intriguing still was what stood at the garden's center. A simple wooden cross, weathered by years of exposure, but still standing straight and true. No name marked the cross, no dates or epitaph, just the plain symbol standing amid blooming prairie flowers that had no natural business growing in such a difficult spot. "Well now," Jesse murmured, crouching to examine the small memorial more closely. The flowers had been tended recently, no weeds competed with their growth, and the soil had been loosened around their bases to help retain precious moisture. Someone visited this place regularly, caring for this unmarked grave with quiet dedication. As Jesse straightened and looked back toward the cottonwood, the connection between the tree, the lantern light, the sitting bench, and this small memorial began to suggest a story, one involving waiting, loss, and remembrance. But the details remained tantalizingly out of reach, like a half-remembered dream. Returning to his campsite, Jesse found his curiosity now firmly hooked by the gentle mystery surrounding this seemingly ordinary place. On impulse, he decided to stay another night to see if the lantern would appear again, and perhaps to encounter whoever tended the flower garden at the unmarked cross. "Change of plans, girl," he told Penny as he removed his saddlebags from where he'd packed them. "Hope you don't mind another day of good grazing." The delayed departure gave Jesse time to more thoroughly assess his surroundings. Throughout the morning, he gathered wood for his fire, refilled his canteen from the water barrel on his pack horse, and walked the perimeter of the clearing, his practiced eye noting signs of regular human presence. A faint trail leading eastward that he hadn't noticed the previous evening. Occasional boot prints of smaller size than his own, marking someone's path between the cottonwood and the flowered grave. As midday approached, the sound of distant hoofbeats drew his attention. Jesse wasn't particularly concerned. He had nothing worth stealing, and his position near the cottonwood was visible enough that trying to hide would seem more suspicious than simply greeting whoever approached. Still, frontier caution had kept him alive this long, so he casually checked that his revolver sat easily in its holster as he continued arranging his campsite. A few minutes later, a rider crested the gentle rise to the east. The figure that approached was not what Jesse might have expected in these parts. Not a cowhand, drifter, or lawman, but an elderly woman astride a dappled mare almost as grey as her neatly pinned hair. She rode confidently despite her years, back straight in the saddle, reins held in hands that showed the wear of decades of ranch work. A wide-brimmed hat protected her face from the summer sun, and simple, practical clothing spoke of a life built on utility rather than fashion. She slowed her horse as she spotted Jesse's campsite, assessing him with the careful gaze of someone who had learned to quickly measure strangers. Whatever she saw apparently satisfied her concerns, as she directed her mare directly toward him rather than giving his camp a wide berth. "Afternoon," Jessie called, raising a hand in greeting as she approached. "Good day to you," she replied, her voice carrying the slight rasp of age but clear and direct. "Don't often see travelers camping here. Most prefer the crossing 5 miles south, where the creek still holds water." "Found this spot as evening was coming on," Jessie explained. "Seemed peaceful enough and my horse needed rest." The woman nodded, her weathered face thoughtful as she studied him. Jessie guessed her to be in her 70s, though the frontier aged people in unpredictable ways. Her eyes remained sharp and clear, missing nothing as they took in his campsite, his horses, and Jessie himself. "I'm Margaret Abernethy," she offered after a moment. "My ranch lies just over that rise to the east. These acres around the cottonwood aren't strictly mine, but I keep an eye on them nonetheless." "Jessie Harlan," he replied with a respectful nod. "Just passing through on my way south. Hope I'm not trespassing on private concerns." Margaret dismounted with surprising agility for her years, patting her mare's neck before loosely securing the reins to a low branch. "No trespass," she assured him, "though this place does hold private meaning for some of us who've lived hereabouts longer than most." Jessie noticed she carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, which she held carefully as she approached the cottonwood. "I saw the memorial garden down by the creek," he acknowledged, deciding directness might be appreciated more than dancing around the matter. "And something else too, a light in this tree last night, up high among the branches." Margaret paused, turning to study him more intently. "Did you know?" she asked, neither confirming nor denying the observation. "And what did you make of such a thing?" "Nothing yet," Jessie admitted, "though I'm curious enough that I've delayed my journey to perhaps see it again tonight." A slight smile touched the older woman's lips. "Curiosity's a quality I've always respected, Mr. Harlan, when it comes paired with proper respect. Too many pass through these parts seeing nothing beyond their own concerns, blind to the stories written in the land around them." She moved to the stump bench Jessie had discovered earlier, settling herself upon it with the ease of long familiarity. The bundle she carried was placed carefully beside her as she gestured for Jessie to join her. "Since you've seen Elizabeth's lantern and found interest enough to stay, perhaps you should hear the tale behind it," she offered. "That is, if you've patience for an old woman's storytelling in the middle of your travels." Jessie settled cross-legged on the ground near the bench, genuinely intrigued. "I'd consider it a kindness," he replied honestly. "And I've nowhere pressing to be that can't wait another day." Margaret nodded, her gaze lifting to the cottonwood's highest branches, where Jessie had seen the light. "This tree was already old when the first settlers came to this valley," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. "A landmark for travelers long before any maps marked these territories. The creek beside it flowed year-round then, making this a natural stopping place for anyone journeying through these parts." She unwrapped her bundle as she spoke, revealing fresh wildflowers, similar to those growing at the memorial site. With practiced hands, she began weaving them into a simple but beautiful arrangement as her story continued. "Among the earliest families to settle here permanently were the Wilsons. Thomas Wilson claimed land about 3 miles west of here, good grazing acres with reliable water from the creek. He brought his young wife Elizabeth all the way from Boston, a city girl with fine manners and education, who nonetheless took to frontier life with remarkable determination." Jessie listened attentively, as Margaret's words painted a picture of the young couple establishing their homestead, building a simple cabin, breaking soil for crops, while gradually acquiring a small herd of cattle. The challenges of frontier life tested them severely: drought years, harsh winters, isolation. Yet their bond remained strong, their commitment to building a life together unshaken. They'd been here 4 years when Thomas needed to make the journey to Fort Mercer, Marguerite continued, her fingers steadily working with the flowers. A matter of securing their claim properly through the territorial office there and purchasing supplies they desperately needed before winter. Elizabeth wanted to accompany him, but she was carrying their first child after years of hoping, and the journey was deemed too risky in her condition. The familiar elements of frontier separation emerged in her tale. The reluctant goodbye, the promises to return by a certain date, the careful preparations to ensure the one left behind would manage until reunion. Thomas Wilson departed with 2 pack horses, laden with pelts and other trade goods, expecting to return within 3 weeks. Elizabeth walked with him, as far as this cottonwood, Margaret said, gesturing to the grounds surrounding them. And each evening after his departure, she would come here to sit, watching the western trail for signs of his return. As days stretched into weeks with no sign of Thomas, Elizabeth maintained her vigil. Even after the expected return date passed, she continued coming to the cottonwood each evening, a lantern in hand to guide her husband home through darkness if he should appear on the horizon as night fell. A month became 2, Margaret said, her voice softening. Autumn storms came early that year. The creek flooded twice. Still Elizabeth came, her child growing within her, her faith in Thomas's return unwavering, even as neighbors began to exchange worried glances when her name was mentioned. Jesse found himself deeply engaged in the tale, easily imagining the young woman walking from her homestead each evening, regardless of weather, taking her place on this very bench where Margaret now sat, lantern at her side, as she watched the western trail with determined hope. When winter arrived properly, with snow covering the trails and temperatures that froze water solid in buckets overnight, Elizabeth could no longer make the daily journey, Margaret continued. Her time was near, the child almost ready to enter the world. Neighbors insisted she stay close to her cabin, and reluctantly she agreed. Margaret had finished arranging her flowers, creating a simple but beautiful bouquet bound with a strip of faded blue ribbon. She held it in her lap as she continued, her gaze now fixed on the distant western horizon. She gave birth during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. A healthy son, who she named Thomas after his father. The women who attended her said she showed remarkable strength throughout, never once crying out despite the difficult labor. But afterward, Margaret paused, a shadow passing over her features. The birth took too much from her. Fever set in by morning. By the following nightfall, Elizabeth was gone. Jesse felt the weight of the story's inevitable turn, the tragedy that had been hinted at from the moment Margaret began speaking. Yet something didn't align with the evidence he'd observed. The unmarked grave by the creek, the regular tending of flowers, the light he'd seen in the tree. The neighbors buried her there by the creek, Margaret explained, answering his unspoken question. The ground was frozen too hard closer to the homestead, but here near the water, it remained workable enough to dig a proper grave. They made a simple marker, planning to replace it with something more fitting when spring came. She rose from the bench, moving with that same surprising grace that belied her years. 3 days after they laid Elizabeth to rest, Thomas Wilson returned. The revelation hung in the air between them, the cruel timing a familiar element in frontier tales, where distance and difficulty so often separated loved ones during life's most critical moments. Jesse remained silent, allowing Margaret to continue at her own pace as she walked slowly toward the cottonwood's massive trunk. His journey had taken far longer than expected. Heavy rains washed out trails, forcing long detours. One of his pack horses went lame, requiring weeks of rest before it could travel again. A fever kept him bedridden in a stranger's home for nearly a month. She touched the cottonwood's rough bark with a gentle hand. When he finally arrived home to find his wife buried and his newborn son being cared for by neighbors, something broke in Thomas Wilson. The story's continuation held the quiet devastation Jesse had anticipated. Thomas Wilson's inability to bond with his son, his withdrawal from community, his eventual abandonment of the homestead he and Elizabeth had worked so hard to establish. He left his son in the care of neighbors who had already come to love the boy, sold his land and stock for a fraction of their worth, and disappeared eastward, supposedly returning to Boston, though no confirmation of his arrival there ever reached the settlement. Young Thomas grew up strong and healthy, raised by good people who never let him forget the mother who had given her life bringing him into the world, Margaret said. Married, had children of his own, and eventually established a successful ranch that his grandsons run to this day. She returned to the bench, lifting the bouquet she had created. But here's where the story takes its curious turn, Mr. Harlan. 1 year to the day after Elizabeth's death, the first rider reported seeing a light in this cottonwood at night. A lantern's glow, high among the branches where no person could reach. Word spread quickly, and soon others witnessed the same phenomenon. Margaret stood, indicating that Jessie should follow as she began walking toward the creek bed, where the small memorial garden grew. Some believed it was Elizabeth's spirit, still keeping her vigil, still watching the western trail for a husband's return. Others dismissed it as trick of moonlight on leaves, or reflections from distant campfires. But year after year the light appeared, always on certain nights, always in the same place, among the highest branches. They reached the small gravesite, and Margaret knelt carefully to place her newly created bouquet beside the weathered cross. I come each week to tend her flowers and keep her company for a little while, she explained. Been doing so for 53 years now, since my own Robert passed and left me to run our ranch alone. As Margaret arranged the flowers, Jesse noticed something he'd missed during his earlier inspection. A small object, half buried in the soil beside the cross. When Margaret saw his attention focused on it, she gently brushed away dirt to reveal an old lantern key, the kind used to adjust the wick in oil lanterns, its metal worn smooth by years of handling. Elizabeth's lantern key, she explained, found among her possessions after her passing. Thomas Wilson placed it here before he left, the one acknowledgement he made of her burial. Neighbors wanted to give him the lantern itself as a keepsake, but no one could find it after her death. Some thought Thomas took it with him, others believed it was buried with her, though no one who attended the burial remembered seeing it placed in her grave. Margaret rose, brushing soil from her hands. The mystery of the missing lantern only added to the tale of the light in the cottonwood. For generations now, folks hereabouts have reported seeing Elizabeth's lantern on certain nights, always in the highest branches, always swaying gently as if held in a patient hand. They walked back toward the cottonwood in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the story and its implications. When they reached Margaret's horse, she took the reins but paused before mounting. "You mentioned you saw the light last night," she said, studying Jessie with those sharp, clear eyes. "That's unusual. Most often it appears on significant dates. The anniversary of Thomas's departure, of Elizabeth's death, of what would have been their wedding day. Rarely does it show itself to casual travelers passing through." Jessie considered this, remembering the steady glow among the branches. "Perhaps not so casual," he offered after a moment. "I'm making my way home after a long absence. My sister wrote that our father's health is failing." Understanding dawned in Margaret's expression. "Ah," she said simply. "Then perhaps Elizabeth has a message for you, Mr. Harlan. Those who've studied her appearances over the years believe she shows herself most often to those separated from loved ones. A reminder not to wait too long for reunions, for time is precious and never guaranteed. With surprising quickness, she mounted her dappled mare. I'll take my leave now, but perhaps we'll speak again. If you remain another night and see Elizabeth's light again, consider yourself specially chosen. Not everyone receives second chances to witness such things. Before Jessie could respond, Margaret had turned her horse and started back toward the eastern rise, her straight-backed figure gradually diminishing with distance until she disappeared over the horizon. Jessie stood watching long after she had gone, his thoughts churning with the story she had shared and its uncomfortable parallels to his own situation, the long absence from family, the possibility of returning too late for crucial reunions. The remainder of the day passed slowly as Jessie occupied himself with camp maintenance, care for his horses, and preparation of a more substantial meal than his usual trail fare. As evening approached, he found himself watching the western horizon as the sun began its descent, unconsciously mimicking Elizabeth Wilson's vigil from decades past. Night settled over the prairie with remarkable swiftness once the sun disappeared, stars emerging in countless profusion across the darkening sky. Jessie built his fire higher than the previous night, its warm light creating a circle of visibility around his camp while deepening the shadows beyond. He settled on his bedroll, back against his saddle, coffee cup in hand as he alternated between watching the dancing flames and glancing upward toward the cottonwood's highest branches. Hours passed with no sign of the mysterious light. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Night insects sang their complex chorus, and occasionally distant coyotes called to one another across the vastness of the prairie darkness. Jessie began to wonder if perhaps his previous night's sighting had been unusual indeed, a rare glimpse granted to a passing stranger who would not receive a second viewing. Just as his eyelids began to grow heavy with approaching sleep, a soft golden glow appeared among the cottonwood's highest branches. The light emerged not suddenly but gradually, like a slow exhalation of illumination, until it burned steady and clear against the star-filled sky. As on the previous night, it swayed gently as if stirred by a breeze, though the air around Jessie remained perfectly still. "Hello again," he murmured, setting aside his coffee cup and moving to stand beneath the massive tree. The lantern, if indeed that's what it was, hung at least 30 feet above him, its light casting subtle patterns through the cottonwood's leaves onto the ground below. From this angle, Jessie could almost convince himself he saw a feminine silhouette holding the light, though the impression remained tantalizingly indistinct, like trying to make sense of shadows within shadows. Remembering Margaret's words about Elizabeth's vigilant waiting, Jessie turned to face westward, aligning himself with the direction the bench faced, the direction from which Thomas Wilson had been expected to return. From this perspective, the lantern's position made perfect sense, high enough to be visible from a significant distance to anyone approaching along the western trail, steady enough to serve as a reliable beacon through darkness. "You waited faithfully," Jessie said quietly, speaking to the light, or the presence he sensed behind it. Night after night, never giving up hope he'd return. The lantern's glow seemed to intensify slightly, though Jessie couldn't be certain. This wasn't simply his imagination responding to the emotion he felt building within him. The parallels to his own situation became impossible to ignore. His 3-year absence from family, his sister's letters that had tracked their father's declining health, his own perpetual postponement of the journey home in favor of continuing his aimless wandering. "I understand waiting," he continued, speaking more to himself now than to the light. "But I've caused others to wait instead of doing it myself, made my family keep watch for my return instead of staying where I was needed. The prairie night wrapped around his words, absorbing them without judgment, while the lantern continued its gentle swaying among the branches. Fireflies had emerged again along the creek bed, their intermittent flashing creating a counterpoint to the steady glow above. Jesse sank down onto the stump bench where Elizabeth Wilson had maintained her vigil, his gaze fixed on the western horizon, now invisible in darkness, except where starlight defined its edge. The position felt strangely right, as if he temporarily occupied a space where countless hours of hopeful watching had left an imprint stronger than mere physical wearing of the wood. "I've been running a long time," he admitted to the night, telling myself I needed to see what was over the next rise, beyond the next river, through the next pass. But maybe I've just been avoiding what matters most. The lantern light remained steady as Jesse continued his one-sided conversation with the presence he felt rather than saw. He spoke of his father's struggle to maintain their ranch after his mother's death, his sister's marriage and children who barely knew their uncle, his own restlessness that had driven him ever onward without allowing him to establish roots anywhere. "Tomorrow I'll continue to Armadillo," he finally concluded, rising from the bench as the hour grew late. "And from there home to the ranch. No more delays, no more excuses." As if in response to his declaration, the lantern's glow intensified briefly before beginning to fade, not blinking out suddenly, but gradually diminishing like a deep breath slowly released. Within minutes, darkness reclaimed the cottonwood's highest branches, leaving only starlight filtering through leaves where the golden radiance had been. Jesse returned to his bedroll, a sense of resolution settling over him that had been absent throughout his years of wandering. The light's appearance and subsequent fading after his commitment to return home seemed too precisely timed to dismiss as coincidence, though his practical nature still resisted attributing conscious intention to what might be simply an unusual natural phenomenon. As sleep approached, Jesse found himself wondering about those who had witnessed Elizabeth's lantern before him. Travelers separated from loved ones, perhaps, or individuals facing decisions about staying or leaving. Had they also felt this sense of gentle guidance, this reminder of connections that persisted despite physical distance or the passage of time? His last conscious thought before drifting into deep, restful sleep was a silent acknowledgement to the presence he had felt among the branches. "Thank you for the reminder. I won't wait too long." Morning came with the soft golden light of prairie dawn, birds calling their greeting to the new day as Jesse woke with unusual readiness. Typically, he resented morning's arrival, grudgingly accepting its demand to resume movement, continue journey, establish forward progress. Today felt different, purpose rather than mere momentum driving his efficient breaking of camp and preparation for departure. As he saddled Penny, Jesse noticed movement on the eastern rise where Margaret had disappeared the previous day. A small figure approached on foot. Not the elderly rancher, but a young boy of perhaps 12, leading a pinto pony and carrying something in his free hand. Jesse paused in his preparations, waiting as the boy made his way directly toward the cottonwood. "Morning," Jesse called when the youngster came within conversational distance. "You're out and about early." The boy nodded, studying Jesse with open curiosity but without apprehension. His clothes were practical frontier wear, sturdy trousers, homespun shirt, worn boots that had likely belonged to an older sibling before him. His sun-browned face suggested hours spent outdoors, while his direct gaze showed the confidence of a child, raised to meet adults as equals in the community of survival that frontier life created. "Grandma Margaret said you saw the lantern light," the boy stated without preamble. "2 nights running." Jesse smiled slightly, recognizing the connection. "You must be Margaret Abernathy's grandson." She mentioned your family's ranch lies just beyond that rise. I'm William Abernathy, the boy confirmed with a nod. Most call me Will. Grandma tends Elizabeth's flowers, and I help sometimes. He patted the Pinto's neck affectionately. Storm and I ride out this way most mornings before chores. Jesse finished cinching Penny's saddle while considering this information. Your grandmother told me Elizabeth's story yesterday. Quite a tale. Will nodded, approaching the cottonwood with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had visited many times before. Been coming here my whole life, he said, setting down what he carried, a small wooden box, simply but beautifully crafted. Seen the lantern 6 times myself. First when I was 7, night after my pa broke his leg bad in a cattle drive. Doctor wasn't sure he'd walk again. The matter-of-fact way the boy mentioned the light suggested complete acceptance of its reality, with neither superstitious fear nor need to explain it away. Jesse found this refreshing. Frontier children often developed a practical relationship with mystery, incorporating the unexplainable into their understanding of the world, without requiring it to conform to adult logic. Your grandmother seemed to think it unusual that I saw the light, being just a traveler passing through, Jesse commented as he finished his preparations for departure. Will placed his box carefully at the base of the cottonwood, aligning it precisely with the massive trunk. Not so unusual if you're the right kind of traveler, he replied with the simple wisdom of youth. Elizabeth shows her light to those who need reminding about something important. At least, that's what Grandma says. Jesse watched as the boy opened the wooden box, revealing an interior lined with faded blue fabric, the same shade as the ribbon Margaret had used to bind her flower bouquet. Inside lay various small objects, a smooth river stone, a carved wooden horse, what appeared to be an old coin, and several other trinkets that clearly held personal significance. "What's all this?" Jesney asked, genuinely curious. "Gifts for Elizabeth," Will explained, selecting the carved horse and placing it carefully between 2 prominent roots of the cottonwood. People who see her light often leave something to say thanks. I keep them safe in this box. Bring them out when the weather's fair so she can see them. Take them in when storms come. The simple ritual touched Jesse unexpectedly. This evidence of community acknowledgement stretching across generations. Not formal worship or superstitious offering, but genuine gratitude, expressed through small treasures entrusted to a young boy's care. I believe she helps people, Will continued, arranging the other items in a neat semicircle around the wooden horse, especially at night when traveling's dangerous. 3 winters back, Mr. Jenkins got caught in a blizzard coming back from Armadillo. Said he'd have frozen for certain if he hadn't seen a light leading him to shelter. Found himself right here, under this tree, protected enough from the wind to survive till morning. Jesse nodded, having heard similar tales throughout the frontier. Mysterious lights guiding lost travelers, unexpected shelter appearing when most needed, inexplicable assistance arriving at crucial moments. Skeptics dismissed such stories as exaggeration born of gratitude for good fortune or lucky coincidence, but those who experienced such things often maintained quiet certainty about what had occurred. I should leave something too then, Jesse decided, checking his pockets for an appropriate token. He found little of sentimental value. Years of transient living had taught him to travel light, avoid accumulating possessions that might bind him to places or memories. Finally, his fingers closed around the heavy brass compass his father had given him when he first left home, its case worn smooth from years of handling. For a moment, Jesse hesitated. The compass represented one of his few connections to family, a practical tool that had guided him across unmapped territories when other travelers might have become hopelessly lost. Giving it up meant surrendering both utility and the tenuous link to his distant home. Yet perhaps that was precisely the point. His journey home required internal direction now, commitment rather than mere navigation. With sudden certainty, Jesse knelt and placed the compass among Will's arranged treasures, its brass catching morning sunlight in a brief flare of brightness. "My father's compass," he explained simply. "Seems right that it should rest here when I no longer need outside guidance to find my way home." Will nodded approval, carefully adjusting the compass's position to align with the other object. "She'll keep it safe," he assured Jesse. "Sometimes things disappear from here, but only when they're needed elsewhere." Mr. Peterson left his lucky rabbit's foot after Elizabeth's light led him to water during drought season. 2 years later it vanished, and that same week Johnny Maxwell found a rabbit's foot in his saddlebag, right before he got ambushed by bandits. Bullet hit right where the foot was carried, stopped it from killing him. Jesse smiled at the story, appreciating its blend of frontier practicality and faith in mysteries that operated beyond immediate understanding. Whether coincidence, community storytelling, or genuine supernatural connection, the effect remained the same. People believing themselves watched over, guided when necessary, remembered within larger patterns of existence. "I'd best be on my way," Jesse said, gathering Penny's reins. "Long ride to Armadillo ahead, and then home beyond that." Will closed his wooden box after ensuring all its treasures were properly arranged. "Safe journey," he offered, the simple frontier blessing carrying weight beyond his years. Elizabeth watches the Western Trail, but her light shines in all directions for those who need finding. Jesse mounted, settling into his saddle with the familiar comfort of countless miles traveled. "I appreciate your grandmother's story," he told the boy, "and your tending of these memories. Not many your age would bother with old tales and tokens." Will shrugged, the gesture neither dismissive nor embarrassed. "Stories are how we remember what matters," he replied matter-of-factly. "Grandma says forgetting is the only true death anyone suffers." With those words hanging in the morning air between them, Jesse touched his hat brim in farewell and turned Penny westward, following the trail that Thomas Wilson had taken nearly 70 years earlier. Unlike Thomas, however, Jesse's journey would complete a circle rather than breaking one, returning him to family waiting rather than taking him away from loved ones left behind. As the cottonwood diminished behind him, Jesse allowed himself one backward glance. Will remained beneath the massive tree, morning sunlight filtering through leaves to dapple his figure with shifting patterns of light and shadow. For an instant, so briefly Jesse couldn't be certain he hadn't imagined it, a feminine silhouette seemed to stand beside the boy, a hand resting gently on his shoulder while her other arm lifted in farewell gesture. Then there was only the boy and his pinto, the wooden box and the ancient cottonwood, standing sentinel over a prairie that continued its slow seasonal breathing as it had for centuries before human witnesses arrived to marvel at its mystery. Jesse faced forward again, pressing Penny into an easy trot that ate away at the miles stretching between his present position and his distant home. The compass he had carried for years now rested in other keeping, but he found he didn't miss its weight or guidance. His direction had become clear during 2 nights beneath Elizabeth Lantern. No mechanical device needed to show him the way now that he had finally decided to stop running from what mattered most. 3 days later, as Jesse approached the outskirts of the struggling ranch he had left 3 years earlier, he noticed something unusual. A lantern burned in the window of his family's home despite broad daylight. An old signal from his childhood, meant to guide family members home through darkness or bad weather. As he drew closer, his sister emerged onto the porch, shading her eyes against afternoon glare. Her face showed momentary disbelief before breaking into joyful recognition. her voice calling his name as she ran to meet him. Behind her appeared their father, moving slowly with the aid of a walking stick, but very much alive, his weathered face showing the same mixture of disbelief and joy. "How did you know to expect me?" Jesse asked later as they sat together on the porch, family connections re-establishing themselves through shared meals and careful conversations that navigated the terrain of 3 years' absence. Sarah, his sister, exchanged glances with their father before responding. "3 nights ago I had the strangest dream about a woman standing beneath a cottonwood tree. She told me you were finally coming home, that I should keep a light burning to guide your way." Their father nodded confirmation. "Same dream, same night. Woman I'd never seen before, yet somehow familiar. Said her name was Elizabeth and that you'd left your compass behind but found your true direction. Told us to have faith that journeys separated can still end in reunion if hearts remain constant." Jesse sat in silence, processing this extraordinary extension of the mystery he had encountered. Perhaps Elizabeth's vigilant watching had expanded beyond the cottonwood, her patient waiting transformed into active guidance for those separated by circumstance or choice. Or perhaps the connections between people who loved one another created their own mysterious communications, needing only the right catalyst to manifest across physical distance. Whatever explanation might satisfy rational understanding, the deeper truth required no analysis. Jesse had found his way home through darkness, illuminated by a light kept burning through decades of patient waiting. That same steadfast illumination had prepared his family for his return, bridging separation with renewed connection that felt both miraculous and perfectly natural in its proper timing. As night fell across the ranch that had shaped his earliest understanding of home, Jesse found himself watching the stars emerge above familiar landscape. The same stars had shone above the cottonwood where Elizabeth maintained her eternal vigil. Above the unmarked grave Margaret tended with faithful dedication. Above Will's careful arrangement of gratitude tokens left by travelers guided to safety. The continuity comforted him, not just of celestial constancy, but of human connections that persisted through separation, loss, return, and reunion. Elizabeth's light had shown him more than the way home. It had illuminated the enduring nature of bonds that survived physical absence, the patient faith that sustained those who waited, and the quiet courage required to cease wandering and finally return to where one belonged. Tomorrow would bring the practical challenges of reintegrating into ranch life, contributing to family work, rebuilding relationships altered by his long absence. But tonight, Jesse simply sat in grateful awareness that journeys end as well as begin, and that sometimes the most important direction to follow leads not outward toward new horizons, but back toward the light kept burning in patient expectation of return. As Jesse Harlan settled back into ranch life, the mystery of Elizabeth's lantern remained with him, a gentle reminder of the unseen connections that bind people across time and distance. The frontier was full of such stories for those with ears to hear them, tales of mysterious lights guiding lost travelers, unexplained voices offering comfort in moments of desperation, and landmarks that seemed to hold memories of those who had passed on before. One such story began to circulate throughout the territory some months after Jesse's return home. Travelers passing through Armadillo spoke of strange occurrences at the old Barlow windmill, standing solitary on the plains east of town. Some claimed to hear whispers carried on the wind when the great blades turned, voices conversing in hushed tones impossible to quite make out yet somehow soothing to weary souls who rested in its shadow. The Barlow windmill had stood for nearly 40 years, built by a hopeful farmer who sought to harness the prairie winds to irrigate crops in the unforgiving landscape. Though his agricultural ambitions had ultimately failed, the sturdy structure remained, its weathered wooden blades continuing their slow rotation long after its builder had moved on, a landmark for those traversing the vast open country where distinguishing features were few and precious. Like many frontier landmarks, the windmill had accumulated its share of history and tragedy. The stories varied, depending on who told them, but most agreed that something unusual occurred there on certain nights, when the moon hung just so in the sky and the prairie winds blew from the east, carrying whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. For those with patience to listen, the windmill's whispers offered something rare on the harsh frontier, a moment of peace, of connection to something larger than immediate survival. Some claimed the voices belonged to a family who had sheltered there during a blizzard generations ago, their whispered prayers of gratitude for unexpected sanctuary somehow embedded in the wooden structure itself. Others believed the sounds came from two young lovers who had met secretly at the windmill, their whispered devotions continuing long after both had departed the mortal world. Whatever their source, the whispers brought comfort rather than fear to those who experienced them, in a land where hardship and isolation wore away at the spirit as surely as wind eroded stone. Even mysteries offered solace when they reminded travelers they were not entirely alone beneath the vast prairie sky. The last golden rays of sunset stretched across the plains like honey poured from heaven's jar, casting the solitary windmill in silhouette against the amber sky. Thomas Calloway adjusted his mail satchel, the leather worn smooth from years of faithful service, much like the man himself. At 43, Thomas had ridden the postal routes of New Austin for nearly 2 decades, his once dark hair now streaked with silver that caught the fading light as he dismounted. His mare, Penny, named for her copper coat, nickered softly as he loosened her girth strap, allowing her to breathe more freely during their customary rest at Whispering Mill. The windmill itself stood like a sentinel of a forgotten time, its wooden frame weathered by countless seasons of punishing sun and driving rain. Once it had pumped life-giving water for the Hargrove Ranch, but the drought of '89 had driven the family eastward, leaving their homestead to slowly return to the earth. Only the windmill remained, too stubborn or perhaps too faithful to its purpose to surrender completely to time's inevitable claim. Its blades turned lazily in the evening breeze, creating a rhythmic creaking that seemed to Thomas like the sighing breath of the prairie itself. He had first chosen this spot for its practical merits. The small pond, fed by the windmill's remaining functionality, provided water for Penny, and the elevated position offered clear views of the surrounding landscape, important in territories where the line between traveler and bandit often blurred, depending on desperation and opportunity. But over time, Thomas had developed a curious attachment to this abandoned corner of the world. Something in the solitude spoke to him, offering respite from the peculiar loneliness that could descend even when carrying the words and wishes of others across vast distances. Thomas settled himself against one of the windmill's support posts, retrieving a modest meal of jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag. As he chewed methodically, he observed the transformation of the landscape as dusk claimed dominion from the retreating day. Long shadows stretched and then dissolved into the gathering darkness, while the first hesitant stars appeared in the deepening blue above. Crickets began their nightly chorus, gradually building from isolated chirps to a synchronized symphony that filled the cooling air. It was during this transition, this liminal moment between defined states, that Thomas first heard it. A sound different from the familiar creaking of the windmill's mechanism or the rustle of prairie grass in the evening breeze, a whisper. So faint he initially attributed it to his imagination, perhaps shaped by the isolation and the hypnotic rhythm of the turning blades above. Yet, as he tilted his head, focusing his attention beyond the ambient sounds of approaching night, the impression solidified into unmistakable reality. "Adelaide," came the whisper, barely distinguishable from the wind itself. "Remember, Adelaide." Thomas straightened, scanning the emptiness surrounding the windmill with sudden alertness. No human figure disturbed the landscape. No horse or rider appeared on any of the trails visible from his elevated position. Penny remained calm, methodically pulling at the sparse grass near the pond's edge, showing none of the tension that typically preceded human approach. "Hello?" Thomas called, his voice sounding unnaturally loud after the subtle whisper. No response came beyond the continuing cricket chorus and the steady creak of the windmill's rotation. Attributing the experience to fatigue after a long day's ride, Thomas settled back against the wooden post. Yet, as minutes passed and darkness claimed full possession of the landscape, he found himself listening with unusual intensity, sorting through the natural sounds of the prairie night with newfound attentiveness. Nothing further disturbed the expected progression of evening, however, and eventually Thomas unrolled his bedding for a few hours' rest before continuing his route with the dawn. Sleep came easily to a man accustomed to finding rest in diverse circumstances, but his dreams were unusually vivid, filled with unfamiliar faces and fragments of conversations he couldn't recall upon waking. He rose with the first hint of light on the eastern horizon, feeling somewhat disoriented despite the routine nature of his surroundings and activities. As he prepared coffee over a small fire, Thomas found himself glancing repeatedly at the now silent windmill, its blades motionless in the calm of early morning. "Adelaide," he murmured experimentally, the name feeling strange on his tongue. The word hung in the still air, claiming brief existence before dissipating like the wisps of smoke from his modest fire. No context accompanied the name in his memory, no face, no story, no connection to his own life or experiences, yet something about it resonated with peculiar significance, as if it represented an obligation he had forgotten or a promise left unfulfilled. Dismissing these fanciful thoughts, Thomas completed his morning preparations with practiced efficiency. The postal service operated on unforgiving schedules, and the settlements that depended on his deliveries had little sympathy for metaphysical distractions. Loading his sorted mail into Penny's saddlebags, he mounted with the fluid motion of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it, turning the mare's head toward Benedict Point and the day's first scheduled stop. Yet as they moved away from the windmill, Thomas found himself glancing back more often than usual, watching as the structure diminished with distance until it stood as little more than a matchstick figure against the brightening sky. Something about leaving felt vaguely uncomfortable, like departing a conversation before its natural conclusion. Shaking his head at his own sentimentality, Thomas faced forward and urged Penny into a ground-covering trot that would maintain their schedule without unduly taxing the reliable mare. The day proceeded with unremarkable normality. Deliveries made, new mail collected, brief conversations exchanged with regular recipients along his route. Thomas had long ago discovered that mail carriers occupied a unique social position, neither fully insiders nor complete strangers in the communities they served. People spoke more freely to him than they might to neighbors, sharing confidences and opinions with someone who represented temporary presence without permanent judgment. Over the years, he had accumulated a remarkable collection of stories and secrets, carrying them with the same fidelity as the official correspondence in his satchel. It was during one such conversation in the small settlement of Plainview that Thomas found himself suddenly mentioning the previous evening's experience to Abigail Morton, the local shopkeeper, who always offered him coffee during his bi-weekly visits. "Ever heard of someone named Adelaide connected to Whispering Mill?" he asked casually, as she refilled his cup with strong black brew that bore little resemblance to the trail coffee of his morning routine. Abigail paused, the coffee pot suspended mid-air as her brow furrowed in concentration. At 62, she represented living memory for much of the region's history, having arrived as a young bride during the first significant wave of settlement that followed the railroad's advancement through the territory. "Adelaide Hargrove," she said after a moment, completing the interrupted pour before setting the pot on the shop's cast-iron stove. "The youngest daughter of the family that owned that property before the drought drove them out." "Why do you ask?" Thomas shrugged, suddenly reluctant to share his experience directly. "Just saw the name scratched on the windmill's frame," he improvised. "Made me curious." Abigail settled her substantial form onto the chair opposite him, interest kindling in her faded blue eyes. "Curious indeed, since Adelaide never made it east with the rest of the family. Died of fever just before they abandoned the ranch. They buried her there, if I recall correctly, somewhere near that windmill, in fact. Something cold that had nothing to do with the autumn morning traced its way along Thomas's spine. He maintained a neutral expression with effort, nodding as if the information merely satisfied casual curiosity, rather than confirming something unsettling. "Sad business," he commented, draining his coffee cup with deliberate normalcy. "Family loses their home and a daughter in the same season. Life out here's never been generous with second chances," Abigail agreed, rising to attend to another customer who had entered the shop. "The land takes as often as it gives, and sometimes takes most cruelly from those who loved it best." Thomas departed Plainview shortly thereafter, his thoughts unusually distracted as Penny carried him southward along familiar trails. The information Abigail had shared fit too neatly with his experience to dismiss as coincidence, yet acknowledging any alternative explanation opened doors to possibilities that reasonable men generally preferred to keep firmly closed. He had encountered his share of frontier superstitions during his years of service. Stories of haunted canyons, vengeful spirits, and mysterious lights that led travelers astray. He had always regarded such tales as natural human attempts to impose meaning on a landscape too vast and indifferent to be fully comprehended through conventional understanding. Yet now, with Adelaide's name confirmed as belonging to a young woman buried near the very spot where he had heard the whisper, Thomas found his comfortable skepticism harder to maintain. The rational explanation, that he had indeed seen the name scratched somewhere on the windmill's structure and subconsciously recalled it during his evening rest, felt increasingly inadequate against the clarity of his experience and his certain knowledge that he had never noticed any such inscription during his many previous visits. The question occupied him throughout the day's remaining deliveries, distracting him from his usual observant appreciation of the landscape's subtle transformations as afternoon extended toward evening. By the time he approached the crossroads, where his route divided, one path leading to Armadillo where accommodation awaited, the other returning to Whispering Mill and its solitary camp, Thomas found himself facing a decision more significant than mere choice of lodging. Practicality and routine argued for Armadillo, with its promise of hot food, proper bed, and human company after a long day's ride. Yet something stronger pulled him toward the windmill, a compulsion that felt simultaneously like curiosity and obligation. As twilight gathered around him, Thomas turned Penny's head toward the weathered structure, now visible on the distant horizon, its silhouette darker than the deepening blue of the evening sky. "Let's see if our friend has anything more to say," he murmured to the mare, who flicked an ear backward at the sound of his voice before settling into the steady walk that would carry them to their destination as daylight failed. They arrived as dusk completed its transition to early night, the first stars appearing like distant lanterns guiding travelers through the vast dark prairie. The windmill's blades turned with greater enthusiasm than the previous evening, responding to a freshening breeze that carried the subtle scent of sage and distant rain. Thomas established camp with practiced efficiency, his movements guided by muscle memory while his conscious attention remained focused on the structure looming above him and the subtle sounds of its operation. This night, Thomas made no pretense of ordinary routine. After settling Penny and arranging his minimal camp, he positioned himself directly beneath the turning mechanism of the windmill, where the convergence of moving parts created the most distinct sounds. Leaning against the central support post, he closed his eyes to better concentrate on auditory input, filtering the familiar noises of night insects and distant coyotes from the immediate creaking of aged wood and metal above him. For nearly an hour, nothing beyond the expected sounds reached his attentive ears. Thomas maintained his patient vigilance despite growing doubt, recognizing that expectations often created the most convincing illusions. Perhaps last night's experience had indeed been nothing more than fatigue combined with an overactive imagination, the mind's natural tendency to create patterns and meaning from random stimuli, especially in isolated circumstances where human connection was absent. It was this very thought that occupied him when the first whisper arrived, so faint he might have missed it entirely had he not been listening with such focused intention. "Joseph passed through in 84, came the breathy voice, seeming to emanate from the turning blades themselves rather than any specific direction. "Heading to California with dreams too big for his shoulders." Thomas's eyes snapped open, heart accelerating despite his intellectual preparation for this very occurrence. The whisper had been clearer than the previous night, the content more specific and extended beyond a simple name. He waited, barely breathing, as the windmill continued its steady rotation above him. "Sarah and infant son," came another whisper, moments later, distinct from the first, yet carrying the same quality of distance and fragility. "Buried together when the fever took them both. Spring of 88. With growing astonishment, Thomas realized he was hearing not random fragments, but something resembling a record or register. Names and fates of people connected to this place, delivered in whispered summation as if read from some invisible ledger of the forgotten. For nearly 20 minutes, the phenomenon continued. Brief biographies carried on the wind and somehow captured or perhaps amplified by the windmill's rotating mechanism. Most detailed people unknown to Thomas, travelers who had passed through, settlers who had briefly claimed nearby land before moving on or succumbing to the harsh realities of frontier existence. A few names carried vague familiarity from stories he had heard during his years of service, confirming these were not merely fabrications of his imagination, but contained elements of verifiable history. When the whispers finally faded, returning the night to its natural symphony of insects and distant hunting calls, Thomas remained motionless, processing the extraordinary experience with a mind suddenly expanded beyond its previously comfortable boundaries. Whatever explanation might eventually satisfy his rational understanding, the immediate reality demanded acknowledgement. Whispering Mill had earned its name through means that defied conventional explanation, serving as repository for fragments of lives otherwise lost to memory. Sleep came late and fitfully that night, his dreams filled with faces he had never seen, and voices speaking words he couldn't quite comprehend upon waking. Dawn found him tired but strangely energized, filled with a sense of purpose that transcended his official duties as mail carrier. After his morning preparations, Thomas spent an hour carefully documenting what he could recall from the previous night's whispers in a small notebook, normally reserved for tracking special deliveries and registered mail. The habit of record-keeping had been ingrained during his postal training, the emphasis on accuracy and detail serving him well throughout his career. Now he applied those same principles to this unconventional information, noting names, dates, and circumstances with the methodical thoroughness that characterized his professional approach to conventional correspondence. The activity brought a sense of normalcy to an experience that might otherwise have overwhelmed his practical nature, transforming mysterious phenomena into documentable information. As he mounted Penny for the day's deliveries, Thomas found himself possessed by a strange sense of dual purpose. Official carrier of other people's communications, and now unofficial collector of messages from sources that defied easy categorization. The contradiction might have troubled him more had his profession not already accustomed him to serving as conduit between separated individuals, rendering distance temporarily irrelevant through faithful transmission of written thought. His route that day would not bring him back to Whispering Mill by nightfall, necessitating accommodation in the small settlement of Tumbleweed. The interruption frustrated his newfound fascination with the windmill's phenomenon, yet also provided opportunity for further investigation of a different sort. Tumbleweed boasted among its modest population one Emmett Larson, retired schoolteacher whose passionate interest in local history had earned him a reputation as unofficial historian for the surrounding region. Thomas had delivered mail to Emmett for years, occasionally lingering for conversations that invariably proved more educational than he had anticipated. The elderly teacher possessed not only extensive knowledge of regional development, but genuine understanding of how individual lives and larger historical movements intertwined to create the complex tapestry of frontier experience. If anyone might offer insight into Thomas's unusual discoveries, Emmett represented the most promising resource within reasonable distance. The day's deliveries proceeded with agonizing slowness. For a man newly possessed by purpose beyond professional obligation, when Thomas finally arrived in Tumbleweed late that afternoon, he completed his official duties with uncharacteristic haste before seeking out Emmett's modest home on the settlement's eastern edge. The retired teacher welcomed him with genuine pleasure, clearly delighted by unexpected company despite the late hour of Thomas's arrival. The Postal Service sends its finest representatives at increasingly irregular intervals, Emmett observed with dry humor as he ushered Thomas into his book-lined sitting room. At 76, he retained the erect posture and precise diction that had commanded respect from generations of students, though time had whittled his once substantial frame to wiry essentials. To what do I owe this extension of professional courtesy? Beyond mere delivery of my subscription to Scientific American, information exchange rather than delivery, Thomas replied, accepting the offered chair with appreciation for both its comfort and the conversation it facilitated. I've encountered something unusual near Whispering Mill that might benefit from your historical knowledge. Interest kindled immediately in Emmett's faded eyes. The Hargrove property, he noted, reaching for his pipe with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned to compensate for joints stiffened by age and the region's unforgiving climate. Significant example of homesteading ambition exceeded by environmental realities. What aspect has captured your attention? Thomas hesitated, suddenly aware of how his experience might sound to educated ears. Yet something in Emmett's expression, genuine curiosity untainted by premature judgment, encouraged honest disclosure rather than sanitized inquiry. The windmill speaks, he stated simply, watching closely for the older man's reaction. Or perhaps more accurately, it somehow captures and transmits voices that seem to recount the histories of people connected to that area. He expected skepticism, perhaps gentle redirection toward rational explanation. Instead, Emmett nodded thoughtfully as he packed his pipe with careful attention, neither immediately accepting nor dismissing the statement. Acoustic phenomena often acquire supernatural interpretations in isolated locations, he observed, striking a match with practiced precision. The interaction of wind with certain structures can produce sounds remarkably similar to human vocalization. Yet my experience suggests premature rationalization often proves as misguided as uncritical acceptance of supernatural claims. He drew thoughtfully on his pipe, establishing the proper burn before continuing. What exactly did you hear, and under what conditions? Thomas described his experiences with the factual precision of a man accustomed to accurate reporting, referencing his notebook when necessary to ensure fidelity to original perceptions. He omitted nothing, including his confirmation of Adelaide Hargrove's identity through conversation with Abigail Morton, and his own initial skepticism regarding possible explanations. Emmett listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or adjusting his spectacles, but offering neither encouragement nor discouragement through expression or gesture. Only when Thomas concluded his account did the older man finally respond, removing his pipe with deliberate care. I've collected oral histories throughout this region for nearly 3 decades, he stated, gesturing toward numerous leather-bound journals arranged chronologically on his shelves. Many of the names and circumstances you've recorded align with documented accounts, particularly regarding travelers who perished during the migration to California goldfields in the 1850 CA. He tapped his pipe thoughtfully against his palm, dislodging ash into a small ceramic tray beside his chair. More intriguing is your experience with Adelaide Hargrove. The circumstances of her death and burial location were never widely known beyond immediate family and a few neighbors. Your accurate acquisition of this information without prior knowledge suggests more than coincidental imagination at work. Relief flooded through Thomas at this validation from a source he respected. Then you believe what I heard was real? He asked, immediately recognizing the question's inadequacy for addressing experiences that challenge conventional categories of reality. Real encompasses more possibilities than our limited vocabulary generally acknowledges, Emmett replied, with the precise articulation of a man who had spent decades helping others appreciate language's nuances. I believe you experience authentic communication through means not yet fully understood by current scientific frameworks. Whether these communications originate from departed consciousness, residual emotional energy, or previously unrecognized properties of sound transmission through certain materials and atmospheric conditions, remains open to investigation. He leaned forward slightly, enthusiasm visible beneath his scholarly demeanor. What interests me most is the apparent selectivity of these communications. Not random fragments, but specific biographical information preserved and transmitted through some mechanism associated with the windmill's operation. It suggests purpose rather than mere phenomenon. Perhaps preservation of what would otherwise be lost entirely to time and indifference. Thomas considered this perspective, finding it resonated with his own developing impression. Like a registry of lives that might otherwise go unremembered, he suggested. Ordinary people who left no monuments but whose existence mattered nonetheless. Precisely, Emmett agreed, approval warming his academic tone. History's official records favor the exceptional, those who built empires, amassed fortunes, or altered political landscapes. Yet, authentic human experience predominantly comprises quieter lives that together form the true fabric of any era. Their preservation serves essential purpose in maintaining complete understanding of our collective past. The conversation extended well into evening, as Emmett shared relevant historical context for several names Thomas had recorded, occasionally consulting his own journals to confirm details. What emerged was fascinating correlation between Thomas's documented whispers and actual historical individuals whose connections to the region could be independently verified through Emmett's meticulous research. "I'd like to accompany you to Whispering Milt," the older man announced as their discussion finally began winding toward its natural conclusion. "My academic responsibilities have been fulfilled through retirement, but intellectual curiosity remains undiminished by advancing years. This phenomenon warrants first-hand observation by someone with comprehensive contextual knowledge of regional history." Thomas hesitated, concerned about the physical demands such an expedition might place on a man of Emmett's age. "The location is isolated," he cautioned. "No proper accommodation beyond what portable comfort a bedroll might provide against increasingly cool autumn nights." Emmett dismissed these concerns with the impatient gesture of a man long accustomed to others underestimating his capabilities. "I conducted field research throughout these territories decades before retirement confined my explorations primarily to printed sources. One night beneath stars rather than roof boards represents welcome return to methods that produced my most significant historical documentation." Recognizing genuine determination behind the declaration, Thomas nodded agreement. "I return to my regular route tomorrow, which brings me back past Tumbleweed the following afternoon. If you're prepared by then, we could reach Whispering Mill by dusk, apparently the optimal time for these manifestations." The arrangement satisfied both men, providing Thomas opportunity to complete his professional obligations while allowing Emmett sufficient time to prepare adequately for field excursion despite his advanced years. They parted with shared anticipation of collaborative investigation into phenomenon that challenged conventional understanding, while potentially contributing valuable perspective on regional history's underrepresented participants. The intervening day passed with excruciating slowness for Thomas, each delivery feeling like unnecessary delay rather than fulfillment of valued service. By the time he returned to Tumbleweed the following afternoon, anticipation had transformed into barely contained impatience, evident in his accelerated pace as he approached Emmett's modest home at precisely the appointed hour. He found the retired teacher waiting on his small porch, a well-worn leather satchel at his feet, and enthusiasm visible despite attempts at scholarly composure. More surprising was the additional figure present, a medium-sized dog of indeterminate breeding with intelligent eyes and a coat that suggested multiple genetic contributions rather than any recognizable pedigree. "Meet Roosevelt," Emmett introduced as the animal regarded Thomas with cautious assessment. Named for his progressive attitude toward unfamiliar situations, rather than any political affiliation, he appointed himself my companion 3 years ago and has proven remarkably adaptable to scholarly routine interrupted by occasional adventure. Thomas, who generally appreciated canine companionship despite his itinerant lifestyle preventing personal ownership, offered his hand for inspection. Roosevelt performed a thorough olfactory evaluation before apparently determining the male carrier represented acceptable association, indicated by a brief tail wag and relaxed posture that stopped short of excessive enthusiasm. "He's welcome if he doesn't bother Penny," Thomas decided, recognizing the practical benefits of enhanced awareness that dogs typically provided in isolated locations. "She's generally tolerant of well-behaved company regardless of species." Arrangements completed, they departed Tumbleweed, with Emmett riding a sturdy grey gelding, whose steady temperament complemented his owner's deliberate approach to physical activities. Roosevelt trotted alongside, occasionally ranging ahead to investigate interesting scents, but maintaining consistent awareness of his human companion's progression across the increasingly open landscape that separated settlement from their isolated destination. Conversation during their journey alternated between comfortable silence and Emmett's occasional historical observations regarding landmarks they passed. Small battles fought during territorial disputes, notable travelers who had documented specific features, settlements attempted and abandoned as environmental realities overcame human determination. Thomas found these commentaries fascinating, providing context that enriched landscape he had traversed countless times with newly appreciated significance. They arrived at Whispering Mill as predicted, with sufficient daylight remaining to establish comfortable camp while observing the windmill's transformation from ordinary structure to silhouette against spectacular sunset. Emmett regarded the weathered construction with scholarly appreciation, noting architectural elements that dated its construction to specific period of regional development, while speculating about modification of standard design to accommodate local conditions. Functional engineering often achieves unintentional beauty, he observed, as golden light illuminated the weathered wood with momentary glory before surrendering to advancing dusk. Particularly when time and elements have softened original utilitarian intentions into something that speaks to both past purpose and present endurance. Roosevelt, after thoroughly investigating surroundings with professional canine attention to detail, selected position equidistant between the humans' established camp and the windmill itself. His alertness suggested awareness of something beyond ordinary sensory input, ears periodically adjusting to track sounds inaudible to his human companions as darkness gradually claimed the landscape. Thomas busied himself with practical camp preparations, coffee set to boil over small fire, simple meal arranged for consumption after sunset, bedrolls positioned for optimal comfort on unyielding ground. Emmett contributed by arranging his documentation materials with methodical precision, creating improvised field desk using flat-topped rock, supplemented by contents of his leather satchel. As true night descended and stars emerged with familiar brilliance, both men positioned themselves near the windmill's central structure, Roosevelt joining them with uncharacteristic stillness that suggested recognition of occasion's significance. The breeze that had remained absent during daylight hours now arrived with perfect timing, setting the weathered blades into steady motion that produced familiar creaking rhythm overhead. "Listen with attention unconstrained by expectation," Emmett advised softly as they settled into watchful waiting. Predetermined categories often prevent perception of nuances that might prove most significant. Thomas nodded, understanding, having already learned the value of receptive rather than directive listening during his previous encounters. They remained in companionable silence as darkness deepened around them, each attending to the gradual transition from ordinary mechanical sounds to something more complex and ultimately revelatory. The first whisper arrived with unexpected clarity nearly an hour after full dark, startling in its immediate intelligibility compared to the gradual development Thomas had experienced during previous visits. "Martin Blackwood, cartographer," came the distinct communication, seeming to emanate from the turning mechanism directly above their position. "Documented watershed boundaries in '62 before fever claimed him beneath this very sky." Roosevelt's ears pivoted with precise tracking, confirming the sound's reality beyond mere human imagination. Emmett's expression transformed from scholarly anticipation to profound wonder, his academic preparation temporarily overwhelmed by direct experience of phenomenon previously approached through intellectual framework. He recovered quickly, however, reaching for prepared journal with practiced motion that balanced excitement against scholarly discipline. For nearly 40 minutes, the whispers continued, sometimes offering brief biographical fragments, occasionally presenting more extensive narratives of lives intersecting with this specific location. during westward expansion and subsequent settlement attempts. Emmett documented each communication with meticulous attention, occasionally murmuring confirmation when particular details aligned with his existing historical knowledge. Thomas observed with fascination as the retired teacher's initial amazement gradually transformed into focused documentation, his lifelong habits of scholarly recording reasserting themselves, despite the unconventional nature of information being transmitted. Roosevelt maintained his attentive vigil throughout, occasionally turning towards specific directions, as if tracking movement invisible to human perception. When the whispers finally faded, returning the night to its natural acoustic pattern, a profound silence enveloped their small group, not emptiness, but fullness that required respectful acknowledgement before ordinary conversation could respectfully resume. Emmett finally broke this reverential quiet, removing his spectacles to polish them with handkerchief that provided momentary activity while he organized his thoughts. Extraordinary, he stated simply, the word carrying weight beyond its simple syllables, through tone that acknowledged fundamental shift in understanding. 27 distinct historical individuals, 18 previously documented in my own research, 9 entirely new additions to regional record. Specificity suggests accuracy rather than fabrication, particularly regarding details no casual observer could reasonably possess. Thomas nodded agreement, relieved that Emmett's experience confirmed his own rather than suggesting shared delusion. "What do you make of it?" he asked, genuinely curious how scholarly perspective might interpret phenomenon that defied conventional categorization. The older man considered carefully before responding, replacing his spectacles with deliberate precision. Throughout human history, certain locations have been recognized as possessing unique properties regarding preservation and transmission of memory, he began, his tone suggesting organization of complex thoughts rather than recitation of predetermined conclusion. Ancient cultures constructed specific sites for this purpose. Stone circles, temples, monuments specifically designed to maintain connection between past and present through both physical representation and ritual reinforcement. Modern perspective typically dismisses such practices as primitive superstition, while failing to recognize potential validity in alternative approaches to memory preservation. He gestured toward the windmill, its blades now slowing as evening breeze gradually diminished. This structure was never intentionally created for memorial purpose, yet appears to have inadvertently achieved similar function. Perhaps certain combinations of materials, geographical positioning, and atmospheric conditions occasionally create unintended repositories where memories, or some energy pattern we might identify as such, can be preserved and subsequently accessed under specific circumstances. Roosevelt, apparently satisfied that immediate phenomenon had concluded, settled himself more comfortably beside Thomas, while maintaining alert awareness of surroundings. The dog's practical acceptance of extraordinary experience provided curious counterpoint to human attempts at theoretical framework. Untroubled by categorization, challenges that occupied his human companions, yet clearly perceiving reality beyond conventional sensory input. Their conversation extended well into night, moving from specific analysis of recorded whispers to broader philosophical considerations regarding memory, history, and communication across conventional boundaries of time and materiality. Emmett's extensive knowledge provided context that enriched Thomas's experience beyond mere curiosity, transforming isolated phenomenon into meaningful connection with broader human experience throughout documented history. "What happens next?" Thomas finally asked, as their discussion gradually approached natural conclusion, genuine question rather than mere conversation extension. "We've witnessed and documented something extraordinary. Does responsibility accompany that privilege?" Emmett nodded approval at question that demonstrated ethical consideration beyond mere intellectual curiosity. Indeed, he confirmed, stroking his grey beard thoughtfully. Knowledge without appropriate application represents incomplete process at best, potential irresponsibility at worst. He gestured toward his documentation journal, filled with carefully transcribed whispers. These voices sought preservation when confronting oblivion. Ordinary lives deserving remembrance despite lacking conventional historical significance. Our accidental discovery of their repository creates obligation to ensure their continued existence through more conventional transmission. The practical implementation of this philosophical position occupied remaining hours before sleep claimed them. Plans for systematic documentation during future visits. Potential publication of findings framed appropriately for historical society archives. Consideration of how to preserve the windmill itself from structural deterioration that might eventually compromise its unique properties. Morning arrived with characteristic southwestern clarity, transforming previous night's mysterious atmosphere into mundane landscape of weathered wood against endless sky. Yet Thomas recognized that ordinary appearance now concealed extraordinary significance he would never again overlook during future visits. Whispering Mill had transformed from convenient resting point to meaningful destination. Depository of forgotten voices deserving respectful attention and preservation. As they prepared for departure after morning meal, Emmett surveyed the windmill with scholarly appreciation tinged by newfound wonder. "I shall return with proper documentation equipment," he declared, patting his horse's neck with unconscious affection. "These voices deserve systematic recording beyond what single night's hasty notation could provide." Thomas nodded agreement while securing his postal satchel, professional habits reasserting themselves as day's regular duties beckoned. "My route brings me here regularly," he confirmed. "You're welcome whenever scholarly curiosity or historical responsibility compels return visit." What neither anticipated was Roosevelt's apparent decision regarding immediate arrangements. As they mounted their respective horses, the dog positioned himself deliberately beside Thomas, rather than returning to Emmett's stirrup as expected. After brief confusion, understanding dawned in the older man's expression. "It appears Roosevelt has temporarily reassigned himself," Emmett observed with mixture of amusement and resignation. "He occasionally determines alternative arrangements better serve immediate purposes. I've learned not to question canine wisdom regarding appropriate deployment of available resources." Thomas regarded the dog with surprised appreciation. "You're certain? I maintain demanding schedule with irregular accommodations." "His decision, not mine," Emmett replied with philosophical acceptance of partnership that accommodated individual agency despite species difference. He'll either remain with you until mission completion or return when novelty diminishes, whichever proves consistent with his inscrutable but generally practical purposes." And so, Thomas departed Whispering Mill with unexpected companion, Roosevelt trotting alongside Penny with purposeful determination that suggested full commitment to whatever mission had prompted his temporary reassignment. The arrangement felt strangely appropriate. Mail carrier and dog, united in service to voices that deserve delivery beyond isolation of abandoned windmill. Over subsequent weeks, Thomas established new routine that incorporated regular documentation visits to Whispering Mill, sometimes accompanied by Emmett when academic schedule permitted extended field excursion, always with Roosevelt, whose attendance never wavered despite opportunities to choose alternative companionship. The dog demonstrated remarkable adaptation to postal routine, maintaining dignified comportment during official deliveries while offering silent companionship during isolated evening camps where Thomas continued collecting whispered histories. Word gradually spread through scattered settlements along Thomas's route, subtle at first, then with increasing interest as certain recipients recognized names from whispered accounts that connected to their own family histories. What began as solitary curiosity evolved into community project, with various individuals contributing family records, old letters, and personal recollections that provided context for voices preserved through the windmill's mysterious properties. Abigail Morton proved particularly valuable contributor, her decades of shopkeeping having provided unparalleled opportunity to collect stories from diverse travelers passing through Plainview. Her meticulous memory, combined with practical organization skills developed through inventory management, created an informal archive that supplemented Emmett's more scholarly documentation with practical details of daily life, otherwise lost to official historical record. 6 months after his initial experience, Thomas arrived at Whispering Mill, accompanying a small group that included Emmett, Abigail, and 3 other individuals whose family histories intersected with voices documented during previous visits. Roosevelt, now permanently established as Thomas's traveling companion, led their procession with dignified awareness of occasion's significance, positioning himself beside the windmill's central support with evident expectation as evening approached. They had come not merely to listen, but to acknowledge, to demonstrate through physical presence that these preserved voices had successfully reached new audiences who recognized their significance. Emmett had suggested the gathering as appropriate response to phenomenon that appeared fundamentally concerned with ensuring remembrance, providing witnesses who could carry these histories forward through conventional human transmission. As darkness descended and breeze awakened the windmill's voice, Thomas observed a profound impact on those experiencing the phenomenon for first time. Expressions transformed from skeptical curiosity to wonder, and eventually deep appreciation as whispers carrying fragments of forgotten lives emerged from mechanical creaking with impossible clarity. Several visitors quietly wept upon hearing names connected to their own ancestry, receiving confirmation of family stories previously dismissed as exaggeration or invention. What Thomas hadn't anticipated was response from the windmill itself to this gathered audience. The whispers that evening demonstrated unprecedented organization and clarity, presenting connected narratives rather than fragmented biographies, building relationships between previously isolated accounts to create comprehensive tapestry of regional experience across decades of settlement, hardship, and occasional triumph against environmental challenges. "They know they're being heard," Abigail whispered to Thomas during brief interval between whispered accounts. "Like any of us, they speak more clearly when certain of receptive audience." The observation captured essential truth that transcended rational explanation. Communication represented relationship rather than mere information transmission, with both parties contributing to successful exchange regardless of unconventional barriers separating them. These voices from beyond conventional boundaries had found what all communication ultimately sought: genuine reception by those who recognized value in what was shared. As their extraordinary evening concluded and the group prepared for return to more conventional existence, Thomas found himself lingering slightly apart, aware of subtle shift in the windmill's significance for him personally. What began as curiosity had evolved through wonder into something approaching reverence, not for supernatural phenomenon, but for ordinary lives preserved through extraordinary means, for persistent human determination to be remembered beyond physical existence. Roosevelt joined him in this momentary contemplation, pressing warmly against his leg with silent companionship that required no verbal articulation. The dog's practical acceptance of extraordinary circumstances provided valuable perspective. Reality encompassed more than conventional categories acknowledged, yet remained fundamentally accessible to those willing to listen with appropriate attention. "We should go," Thomas finally acknowledged, resting hand briefly on weathered wood that had supported structure through decades of harsh conditions. "But we'll return." The promise encompassed more than mere visitation schedule. Whispering Mill had transformed from geographical landmark to meaningful destination. Depository deserving protection, documentation, and regular witnessing by those who recognized value in preserving ordinary voices that collectively created authentic historical record beyond official documentation. As Thomas mounted Penny for departure, Roosevelt already positioned expectantly beside the trail. He glanced back at the solitary structure silhouetted against star-filled sky. The windmill's blades turned with steady purpose in freshening night breeze, continuing their eternal conversation with passing wind long after human witnesses departed. What had once seemed abandoned now revealed itself as anything but forgotten. A gathering place where memory persisted through mysterious means that defied conventional explanation. While serving fundamentally human purpose, the mail would continue its rounds tomorrow, carrying words between separated individuals who sought connection despite distance. Thomas would resume his role as official messenger, delivering conventional communications with professional reliability that had defined his decades of service. Yet he now carried additional purpose beyond governmental appointment. Unofficial curator of voices that whispered from boundaries of conventional existence, seeking only acknowledgement that their lives had meaning worthy of remembrance. With Roosevelt trotting beside his horse and stars illuminating familiar trail that led temporarily away from Whispering Mill, Thomas felt curious contentment despite unanswered questions that remained. Complete understanding might prove permanently elusive, yet meaning had emerged with sufficient clarity to provide direction. Some messengers carried letters, others preserved voices that whispered between worlds. Both services honored essential human need for connection that transcended ordinary limitations of time, distance, and even conventional existence itself. Behind him, barely audible as distance increased, the windmill continued its patient conversation with passing wind, gathering whispers that would await his return. And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the west be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight.